This is the sixth panel of this great conference. Welcome. I would also like to thank Hrag Foundation for holding such a great conference and for inviting me as a moderator. And there are many other reasons for us to thank Hrag Foundation. Great works are created and produced. We are all very grateful. And the light that Hrag held is still carried forward, and it is something that really puts a light in front of us in such dark times, I believe. Human Rights Academy is part of this conference, and I believe that the foundation deserves another mention for this. And this is a very sensitive topic that Turkish academia is unable to study. In terms of these reasons, Minority Rights Academy will inspire Turkish academic world, I believe. And the conference is also quite important because this is the centennial year of the Republic, because we are talking about a time period that shouldn't be celebrated but rather remembered, I believe. And those who do not really consent to celebrating Republic in its current state. I think this is a conference for those people like us, and this conference also makes us remember the following. Every official celebration would mean an unofficial mourning, and every conference would also mean solidarity, and we've seen many declarations and papers that have emphasized that. In this panel, we are going to talk about identity, belonging, and exclusion, and we will be hearing speeches on these areas. We have three panelists, Hülya Delihüseyinoğlu, Hrag Papazian, and Cemreina are with us. I will introduce them, and I will give the floor to them. I will start with Hülya Delihüseyinoğlu. She's an independent scholar focusing on the currents of the Armenian educational field. She has a PhD from Boğaziçi University's Atatürk Institute for Modern Turkish History. Her research, highlighted in her dissertation titled Armenian Schools in Contemporary Turkey, Governmentality, Community Resilience, examines the nuanced complexities of governance and resilience within Armenian schools, with a dedicated academic journey, including an MA in Conflict Analysis and Resolution from Sabancı University and a BA in Political Science and International Relations from Boğaziçi University. She brings a novel perspective to analyze Armenian cultural sustainability in contemporary Turkey. Delihüseyinoğlu's paper is on governing Armenian schools through ambiguity, and she also has participated in international conferences like Northwestern University's Cayman Modern Turkish Studies article workshop. Her practical experience in various civil society organizations underscores her versatility in the field. Currently living in Chicago, she continues her scholarly dedication to addressing contemporary challenges and current predicaments faced by Armenian citizens in Turkey. And Governing Armenian Schools Through Ambiguity is the title of her speech. Thank you very much, and I would like to thank all the contributors to Hrag Foundation. I'm also one of the former employees of this foundation, and the fact that I'm coming back again is great. And I will also share my presentation with you. In order to make sure that people are more comfortable, I prepared my speech in Turkish, but my slides will be in English. So, Governing of Armenian Schools with Ambiguity, this is how I translated it because we're talking about the transformation of global economic systems, and governance mentality is also changing. And this also makes us look at the legal framework of minority schools, Armenian schools, how they are managed. And we need to bring up this question again in terms of minority rights. And this is the centennial year of Lausanne, and minority rights are being discussed right now, and it's quite a very timely and relevant event for us. Armenian schools and understanding its present will require us to look at a wider perspective and frame, but I will have a narrow look right now. I will see the legal practices around the governance of Armenian schools. So Armenian schools in Turkey have a very deep-rooted history, but Turkey is unable to come to terms with its past, and Armenian schools and other elements of natural cultural heritage always remained behind a curtain of invisibility. The widespread narrative and denial habitus, as Talin Sujian has put it, obscures the past and present visibility of Armenian school and social life. This causes the Armenian educational and intellectual heritage to be seen as a folkloric richness or an exotic element, disconnected from its historical and political context. However, uh, However, there were many monk teachers who traveled and moved within the borders of the empire back in the history. And in the 15th centuries, it actually started as religious education. In the 18th century, the curriculum system and school structuring began with the addition of courses such as math, geography, and law, as well as religious education. And Selim III introduced a reform in education, and we see that education practices have become institutionalized. And in the 19th century, there were Armenian intellectuals who were influenced by the intellectual movements that started in Europe in the 19th century. They went to Europe to receive education, modernized and secularized the institution of the Armenian society, accelerated modern education with the Armenian Renaissance they initiated. The number of Armenian schools is increasing rapidly, especially after the reform period of the Ottoman Empire. So Kevorkian and Papazian also states that by the beginning of the 20th century, there were approximately 3,000 Armenian Apostolic, Catholic, and Protestant schools. This is only an estimate, and we're talking about 3,000 students, according to Kevorkian and Papazian. However, the destruction brought about by the massacres and genocide at the end of the 19th and the beginning of 20th centuries irreversibly paralyzed Armenian cultural and intellectual life. Schools and cultural centers become obvious targets of looting and extortion. Schools are closed, abandoned, and eventually their buildings and school materials are seized by the state for use. And the number of minority schools continued to drop in the Republic as well. Currently, we have only 16 schools out of these 3,000 schools back in the past. And this research is based on these 16 schools that we have now in Turkey. And almost all of the schools that are subject of the research were established in the Ottoman Empire from the beginning of the 18th century, and they continue their organizational structure. They maintain their organizational structure, so they are still managed and governed by the foundation that established it, and they are fully integrated into the education system, centrally managed by the Ministry of National Education, but they are governed and subject to the oversight of the ministry. And Armenian language literature can be added to their curriculum, but they are responsible for following the curriculum prepared by the center. For these added courses, they need to prepare a curriculum compatible with the Turkish language of these courses. According to the law, they are bound by, and they have the status of private schools, and they are called private schools, but they are not for-profit organizations. Expenses of the school are covered by income of foundation's real estate, if any, or they also receive donations from parents and philanthropists. And according to the law, only Armenian students who are Turkish citizens can enroll in those schools. And there are 2,800 students enrolled in this education period, ranging from kindergarten to the 12th grade. And this is the list of schools with information on years of establishment and education levels. So among these 16 schools, 2 schools provide education only at high school level, 3 schools from kindergarten to high school, 11 schools from kindergarten to secondary schools level, and all 3 schools provide education as boarding schools. And this is the distribution of schools in Istanbul, and red stands for an Armenian school. And going back to the research, well, this research focuses on the following question. In post-genocide Turkey, how are Armenian schools and their daily practices governed by a nation-state that defines itself through Turkish Islamic values? So in another sense, the research examines the transformation of the governance mentality, specifically in Armenian schools. The methodology of the research is based on interview-based ethnography, which I started in November 2018 and completed in December 2019. Ethnographic research includes attending classes as a spectator, observer, participating in school events as an observer, conversations with teachers in teachers' rooms and between classes. I also had one-on-one or group interviews with administrators and students. And to complete the picture, I also held meetings with parents, graduates, foundation board members, journalists, and lawyers on the subject. And the research is based on interviews with more than 120 people, although its duration and format vary. And in order to eliminate material errors, I examined the mentioned laws, regulations, correspondence between public institutions, and other relevant legal documents. And I wanted to provide further details. That's why I used newspapers, columns, and schools' websites. While Armenian schools or minority schools, the limited literature on these analyzes schools with reference to an oppressive state that rigorously controls their operation and acts as a coherent decision-making system. In my conversations with the participants during the fieldwork, we often talked about how Armenian schools experience this understanding of dominant power. For example, as a result of state-centered curriculum development and textbook production, textbooks distributed to schools by the Ministry of National Education in Turkey serve as one of the most important tools in the promotion of Turkish nationalism. As a general policy, as in other schools, it doesn't allow books published outside Turkey to be used in minority schools. However, this also means preventing the use of newly produced Armenian resources for Armenian schools that have access to limited resources. The ministry appoints a Turkish assistant principals to each school from the center. And until recently, these deputy principals or assistant principals served as the sole authority in signing all official documents in schools and maintaining relations with the ministry. While teachers work on a contractual basis in schools, unlike teachers, Turkish language and literature, history, geography, and social studies teachers, known as Turkish culture course teachers, are appointed by the ministry through a central system, and their salaries are paid by the ministry, unlike their colleagues. Until recently, it was mandatory for schools to obtain permission for every activity, theater performance, or demonstration held in schools, and to send the Turkish translations of these events to Istanbul Directorate of National Education. And Turkish translations were expected. As I said, only Turkish Armenians or Armenians who are Turkish citizens can enroll in schools, and the ministry managed this process. And the authority to decide and certify students' eligibility for registration belonged to the Ministry of National Education. In practice, this meant that the ministry decided whether the students were actually Armenian. And Armenian history cannot be included in the curriculum. It cannot be instructed as part of the curriculum. So there are many other examples that I can cite, but I would like to talk about the EU harmonization process, the reform package that was introduced in 2003. Before this, there was a legal obstacle for minority foundations to acquire real estate. This was one of the obstacles to the predictable financing of schools. As I mentioned, Some provisions of these of the legal framework have changed. However, some practices have become obsolete over time. In addition, in the last decade or in the past 15 years, there has been a time period during which we witnessed exceptional gestures made by the ministry. Well, for example, practices such as the ability of school principals to express their preferences in the appointment process of Turkish culture teachers. For example, the addition of Armenian religion questions in the central examination system, allocation of a share to minority schools from the funds given to encourage private school students can be also mentioned here. And we cannot explain the existence of these practices with the studies in the literature that see the state as an institution that inspects minority schools and makes consistent calculations. In the new socioeconomic context, the relationship between the state and schools does not operate so directly.
So this pattern, a similar pattern, is actually seen in cultural foundations and organizations of the Armenian community. Ohannes Kılıç actually talked about this ambiguity through the patriarchate itself. And in this research, I demonstrate that there's a lot of precariousness and ambiguity when it comes to the schools, and these are protected by or maintained by the state so as to create a maneuver area when administering these schools. And also, here's what I mean. The Lausanne Treaty is not recognized by domestic legislation, and the patriarchate elections or foundations reveal how problematic this is when we look at them. And also, we see that there is no local legislation or directive, and the administration of these schools is quite irregular, is quite chaotic, and there's a lot of impromptu solutions brought forward, and that means that schools are left to the arbitrary practices of public authorities. And when it comes to reference documents, there is no document for minority schools. So ministry people, even they do not necessarily know how these processes are to be managed, and they do not know what the requirements are, and so on and so forth. And they are different than private schools and foreign schools, but they are still subjected to the same directive. So when it comes to financial audit or tax regimes, they're expected to fulfill certain standards that private schools are expected to fulfill. Now, obviously, and also there is no umbrella organization within the ministry. The Patriarchate established an education committee this year, but this is not supported by the ministry, and they do not have a legal mandate either. And when it comes to donations and registrations, how to develop an Armenian curriculum, how to train teachers, how to create materials, and how to open up a new Armenian school, I mean, none of this is regulated. All of this is actually quite unregulated. And like I said, there's a lot of ambiguity and a lot of improvisation and a lot of good connections to basically fix things. And contrary to the Lausanne Treaty, these schools are not really protected or do not enjoy a legal status, special status, and they're not really in a position to benefit from state incentives. And there were some reform packages introduced in line with Turkey's EU harmonization process. But again, because of the 74 Court of Cassation judgment, and because of the 36 declaration, and because of a lot of confiscations took place, a lot of schools are in a financial quagmire because they do not have any income. So yes, there is a lot of legal ambiguity, and this is being manipulated, and we see manifestations of this quite extensively across the board. So because of their statuses, they do not have financial sustainability. Only they depend on their donations, and that creates a lot of ambiguity as well. All of these examples reveal that ambiguity is used by powers that be as a tool of manipulation. And also you see some of my references. And, the operation of the government is not achieved through stability, but also ambiguity. Intentionally, they implement policies of ambiguity, and the Turkish judicial system is also quite full of ambiguity, and this is used as a means to maintain the status quo, and this is used as a tool by the government, by powers that be. And also, ambiguity is instrumentalized because of certain factors. In order to have a better understanding of these, we need to take a look at socioeconomic dynamics of the day after the 80s. Because of economic neoliberalization, Turkey went through a transformation, and a new public order was brought into existence as a result. Yes, as part of a global process since year 2000s, the education became neoliberal, and students now focus on learning what is lucrative in the world of business, and this has an impact on Armenian schools as well. And most of the time, this means that the education language is not Armenian, and that there's less Armenian classes. So organizational leadership skills are emphasized, extracurricular activities are emphasized, and as much as possible, foreign language education is provided in these schools. And university entrance exams are central in Turkey, so the content of these tests dominate the curriculum, and classes are dedicated to preparing the students for the central university entrance exam. So the state or the Ministry of National Education doesn't really have to keep a close eye on what is going on in these schools, because students, administrators, teachers, they all implement what is expected of them, because this is what conditions necessitate, and at the end of the day, they become favorable citizens of the state. And this transformation, keeping abreast of this transformation, also means that the state doesn't even need to intervene in certain areas. They forego some of the purposes that they adopted when they were founded, like getting rid of Armenian classes and making sure that schools classes are delivered in Turkish rather than Armenian, so that the students can succeed at the university entrance exam. Now, after the 70s, the state actually did not adopt a predictable method when managing these schools. There's a lack of consistency, there's a lot of ambiguity, and legal ambiguity is favored as a strategy of sovereignty, and this is turned into an instrument, and this is how Armenian schools are administered. And also, neoliberalization has fundamentally changed education all across Turkey, and Armenian schools are no exception. And in order to keep abreast of these changes, schools sort of take certain steps to not fall behind the times. So through ambiguities and also through market dynamics, these schools are reshaped and remolded. And that's why I call the Turkish state the meandering state, because it's a meandering route that the state adopts. There's a lot of strategies, a lot of inconsistencies. New tactics are implemented to manage these schools, and the sovereignty of the state is reproduced continuously. And that's all from my side. Thank you, and apologies if I spoke too fast. Thank you very much, Hülya. And of course, this reminded me that also I used to work at the foundation, but with Ohannes, and I think it's one of the publications of the foundation as well, current problems of the Armenian organizations. And we looked at Armenian schools as part of that study, and we reached a similar conclusion with Ohannes. Actually, ambiguity is instrumentalized not just for Armenian schools, but for Armenian foundations, religious institutions, or non-Muslim communities. This is the very strategy that is very much at play. So I'm happy to hear that you reached the same conclusion. But one more thing that needs to be said, maybe we could open this up for debate later on, but the same ambiguity may also be, may ignite a mechanism of resistance. Certain Armenian schools, certain administrators there, if conditions prevail, they use the same ambiguity to do what they like, to offer some alternatives. Maybe we can discuss that later on. Thank you. Yes, now let's move on to the second presentation, and this will be online. Hrag Papazian will be joining us from afar, from Cambridge. Hrag holds a PhD degree from the University of Oxford, where his dissertation about Armenians in contemporary Turkey was awarded the David Parkin Prize in Ethnographic Materials. His research interests include religion, ethnicity, and race, migration, diasporas and citizenship, conflict, politics and activism, and social boundaries and their making, with a regional and thematic focus on Turkey and Armenia. His peer-reviewed articles have appeared in Turkish Studies and Ethnopolitics. He is currently an assistant professor of anthropology at the American University of Armenia. I think he's joining us from Armenia, so not so far away, yes. He has previously been a postdoctoral scholar at UCLA, a visiting professor at CSU Fresno, and a visiting scholar at the University of Cambridge. Hrag Papazian's presentation is entitled From Gâvur Armenians to Muslim Armenian Gâvuroğlu, Parallel Regimes of Religious and Racial Exclusions in Turkey. So, over to you.
Dr. Uçarlar, for the introduction. And many thanks to the Hrant Dink Foundation for organizing this conference and for including me in the list of presenters. Parev, herkese merhabalar. Armenians in the Republic of Turkey have always been officially acknowledged and treated as a religious minority, as one of the country's non-Muslim minorities. The legal basis of this approach is found in the famous Treaty of Lausanne, signed in 1923, between the newly established Republic of Turkey and the Allied forces. In Section 3 of the treaty, titled Protection of Minorities, the term minority is always preceded by the adjective non-Muslim, thus stressing the religious nature of recognized minorities. The non-Muslim minorities were not explicitly named in the treaty, but in practice, the state has always considered the Armenians, Jews, and Greeks as eligible for that status and for the respective quote-unquote minority rights, such as control over their institutions and schools where they are allowed to teach and learn their languages. The law on private educational institutions, for instance, defines minority schools as those established on the part of the Greek, Armenian, and Jewish minorities, thus specifying those recognized as minorities in Lausanne. This religious division between titulary majority, or the nation, and its others, that is the minorities, is on the one hand a legacy of the Ottoman millet system. However, more than being an out of inertia reproduction of a centuries-old approach, the limitation of minority status to non-Muslim groups was also a result of deliberate Turkish rejection of recognizing more than religious, that is, ethno-linguistic or ethno-cultural minorities during the Lausanne negotiations with the Allies. During one of my visits to the Association of Sivas Armenians and Friends in Istanbul, where I regularly taught Armenian language classes during my fieldwork between 2015 and 2017, a photo of an old identity paper hanging from the wall caught my attention. Given on 5 December 1935, the document mentioned its holder's religion, in Turkish dini, as Ermeni, meaning translatable to Armenian. When I inquired about it, members of the association and the larger community confirmed that many Armenians' religion was designated as Armenian in their legal documents up until a point in the history of the Republic some recalling that there were in practice such mentions even in as late as the 1990s, until the practice was completely changed to mentioning only Christian, Hristiyan in Turkish. In fact, as Fuat Dündar discusses, early state censuses in 1927 and 1935 used the term Ermeni to refer to either religion, in Turkish din, or religious denomination, in Turkish mezheb. As much as these were again an institutional legacy of the Ottoman times, when the Armenian or Ermeni millet was a confessional grouping, they also illustrate how Armenianness or Ermenilik has had a significantly religious connotation in the modern Turkish context as well, including among government officials. Christian Armenians of Turkey thus have always been and today are collectively categorized, legally recognized, and defined as a religious community. I quote, "There is no Armenian community in Turkey. There are the Armenian Apostolic, Armenian Catholic, and Armenian Evangelical communities," explained to me a member of the Religious Council of the Armenian Apostolic Church in Turkey in late 2015. To paraphrase the Archbishop, there is no legally recognized Armenian presence in Turkey except through the religious confessional lens. Like in the case of Jews expected to be Turkish citizens of the Mosaic persuasion, Museviler, rather than ethnic Jews, and I'm citing Bauer here, Armenianness, as seen and defined from above, has had neatly drawn religious boundaries. At the same time, since the early 1920s, despite policies of Turkification directed towards the non-Muslim minoritized groups, the country seen as the Turkey for the Turks perceived the real or main citizens, öz vatandaşlar, to be, I quote, "those who are Muslims of the Hanafi sect and speak Turkish," in the words of a then leading MP Celal Nuri, and Ekmekçioğlu discusses this in her book. Despite their supposed special protection by the Treaty of Lausanne, the non-Muslims were thus relegated to what Ekmekçioğlu calls the status of step citizens, which cost them a series of discriminatory state policies, as well as continuous religious violence in the realm of everyday life. Non-Muslims were discriminated against by formal laws banning them from careers in civil bureaucracy and the military, and even from traveling freely in the country during the early decades. Several of my elderly interlocutors recalled hearing job announcements on the radio, ending with the afternote, "Only Muslim citizens can apply." Alongside the other non-Muslims, Armenians were also targeted by more large-scale policies of what Wimmer calls legalized discrimination, such as the military service of the 20 classes, 20 Kura, forced exclusively on the non-Muslims in 1941, and the property tax law or capital tax law, Varlık Vergisi Kanunu, in 1942, levying incredibly high amounts of taxes on the steppe citizens. Armenians' non-Muslim otherness surfaced once again as a directly consequential marker of difference in 1955, when the 6-7 September pogrom, although initially aimed at the Greeks, also targeted the Armenians and the Jews who saw their shops, religious buildings, and community institutions looted and attacked. In addition to these top-down policies and large-scale events, non-Muslims have been and still are subjected to more subtle yet regular violence targeting their religious alterity in everyday life. Manifesting primarily in the form of hate speech, usually using the label Gâvur, a derogatory term meaning infidel, this type of violence regularly circulates through Turkish print, online, or social media, and appears in state representatives or otherwise political figures' public statements. Furthermore, Christian Armenians' religious identity is also subjected to rather indirect violence when their religious shrines and symbols are attacked, vandalized, and desecrated since the early years of the Republic until our very contemporary times. This very brief exposition should suffice for the purposes of this presentation, though elsewhere I dwell upon this for much longer, to argue that Armenians in the Republic of Turkey have been officially categorized, singled out, and excluded based on their non-Muslim alterity, at least on the formal level, and accordingly witnessing religious discrimination and violence throughout the 100 years of the Republic. Now, all this said, one could guess or expect that Armenians who had or were converted to Islam during and after the genocide beginning in 1915 would avoid the predicament of those who remained Christian, hence officially Armenian, as per the definitions set by the Treaty of Lausanne. In fact, those people and their descendants had joined the ranks of the Muslim majority, thus ceasing to be members of the quote-unquote Armenian community or Ermeni Cemaate. As they could not, and their descendants recently coming out as Muslim and Alevi Armenians cannot benefit from the rights and protections supposedly guaranteed for Armenians by the Treaty of Lausanne, such as attending the Armenian community schools in Istanbul, they would similarly not face any anti-Armenian discrimination, violence, and exclusion, one could reason. But despite letting go of Christianity and official Armenianness, quote-unquote, of course, descendants of Islamized Armenians are often not welcomed into the Turkish nation and its Muslim majority either, and are still stigmatized and mistreated as, this time, Armenians by descent, in contrast to Armenians by religion, as in the case of Christian or quote-unquote official Armenians. These phenomena, I argue, shed light on racialized approaches to Armenianness in Turkey. I met Aharon in a cafe at Maltepe in Asian Istanbul. A 71-year-old man, raised as a Muslim Turk, Aharon is a resident of Malatya, a city in eastern Turkey. "I'm Armenian," he said in a low voice, took a paper out of his pocket, unfolded it, and showed me his hand-drawn family tree as proof. He was extremely careful not to be overheard, but the only dangerous, quote-unquote dangerous theme in his whole story was simply his being of Armenian descent and his recent work towards, as he put it, regaining Armenianness. This cautiousness was not unique to Aharon. It was shared by many of my Muslim or Alevi interlocutors, though to differing degrees. It has one main source: their experience of discrimination and harassment as Ermeniolu Ermenis, Ermeni Dölüs, or Ermeni Pijis, respectively meaning Armenian son of an Armenian, Armenian sperm, and Armenian bastard in Turkish, and note the genealogical, racialized, in fact even racist wording here. He remembers having an Islamic lifestyle during his childhood in Malatya in the 1940s. He knew nothing about his family's past until he was 16, when a friend made fun of him by calling him dönük, a Turkish adjective meaning turned, often used as a label for converts. I quote, "I felt like I'd been shot in the heart," recalls Aharon, "and I ran home to my mother asking for explanations," end of quote. A few days later, his uncle called him after the Friday Islamic prayer and asked to, I quote again, "promise not to tell what you will hear now to anyone, and that for at least 25 years," end of quote. And he told him about their Armenian origins and history of Islamization. Nevertheless, Aharon continued to self-identify and live as a Turkish Muslim, but he was still to experience a whole series of lineage-based discriminatory acts after that first insult of dönük in high school. When he applied to the military school, he was rejected for no obvious reason at all, and was eventually told that he had, I quote, "Armenianness in your genes," as an explanation. "Genlerinde Ermenilik var." Still not giving up on his will to be welcomed into Turkishness, he studied Turkish language and literature in a university in Ankara. He later joined leftist political movements, still not identifying as an Armenian, and was jailed for his political activities in the 90s. In 2006, already 61 years old, he suffered a third discriminatory blow, which became a decisive turning point for him. A friend showed him a news piece on a Turkish nationalist newspaper where his name appeared on a blacklist of pro-Kurdish political activists. Unlike everyone else, though, he was given an additional epithet, Ermeni Dölü, Armenian sperm in Turkish. That is when he realized, as he told me, that his Armenian heritage was inescapable, and finally decided, under the pressure of lifelong racist categorization, to internalize Armenian identity and call himself Aharon, drawing on his great-grandfather's Armenian name. Ancestry-based discrimination was thus a key factor, convincing him that he could never fully become a Muslim Turk, and that what counts, after all, is his öz in Turkish, meaning essence, his ırk, meaning race, his genes and genealogy, rather than his religion, political belonging, and even self-identification. He was the grandson of Aharon, whether he wanted it or not. Origin or ancestry-based anti-Armenian discrimination is a generalized phenomenon that has targeted almost all of my Muslim or Alevi Armenian acquaintances. The state knows it, has been often said to me by many, devlet biliyor, arguing that the state has information about people of Armenian descent. Apart from Aharon, at least 2 other interlocutors told me that their applications to the Turkish army had been rejected only because of their Armenian ancestry. As shown by historian Taner Akçam, the practice of monitoring Armenian converts had started at least in the late Ottoman period during the genocide that led to most of those forced conversions. But it continued during the Republican years as well. Turkish researcher Nevzat Önaran found important documents from within the Turkish Prime Ministry State Archives dating from the 1920s and 30s, which revealed the occurrence of, I quote, secret population censuses, counting citizens who were, I quote again, not of the Turkish ırk, using the word ırk there, translatable to race, and had converted to Islam in the immediate aftermath of 1915. Let us also not forget the statements by former president of the Turkish Historical Society and former member of the Turkish Parliament, Yusuf Halaçoğlu, who claimed to have a list of the names and details of Armenian converts in 2007. Moreover, the Armenian origins of descendants of Islamized Armenians are often not unknown to the population of the villages or towns where they currently live, especially in remote areas in the eastern provinces. Many of my interlocutors spoke about what they called mahalle baskısı, neighborhood pressure on the part of local quote-unquote older Muslims, Turks, Kurds, or Arabs, who would not shy away from occasionally reminding them of their Armenian soy, that is, lineage. In this way, although some scholars perceive the Islamization of Armenians as part of a project of de-Armenizing them, and although the Islamizers themselves might have aimed to de-Armenize and Turkify the converts, somehow neither the Islamized Armenians nor their progeny have been really and completely de-Armenized in the minds of the state and seemingly in the minds of large swaths of society in Turkey. Paradoxically, this project of de-Armenization has faced some resistance by an anti-Armenian racism deeply embedded in post-genocidal Turkish state and society, which has systematically kept track of the lineage of otherwise quote-unquote once Armenians following the religious categorizational or Lausanne logic, making sure to exclude them from the nation despite their apparent eligibility for the title of Turkishness because of being Muslim, and reminding them of their Armenianness every now and then. Thus, Armenianness and Armenians, in their religious diversity, have been and are subjected to distinct but parallel regimes of discrimination and minoritization in post-genocidal Turkey. Whereas in the case of the Christian Armenians, religion is used as the primary tool for exclusion and otherization, it is soy, lineage, and ırk, race, for the Islamized Armenians playing that role, on both popular and at times even institutional levels. Whereas the Christians are labeled and stigmatized as Gâvurs, that is infidels, descendants of Islamized Armenians are perceived and treated as Gâvuroğlus, that is sons of infidels. It's important to note that these two regimes are not mutually exclusive though. On the contrary, they are both put into practice against both the Christian and non-Christian Armenians, but to different extents. Though mostly discriminated against based on their religious alterity, a closer look into the experiences of Christian Armenians reveals racist treatment and racialized conceptions of Armenianness, again, pis Ermeni, dirty Armenian, and even farcical stereotypes among children, such as the one about Armenians having a tail, which is a stereotype more commonly linked to the Kurds, are examples attesting to, again, a blood-based, body-based, biologistic, essentialist type of Armenophobia, of which Christian Armenians are not completely exempt either. Even the state, although officially otherizing them only as non-Muslims, and legally considering them as quote-unquote Turks, since according to the constitution, I quote, everyone bound to the Turkish state through the bond of citizenship is a Turk, end of quote, in certain instances switches its tools of inclusion-exclusion into more essentialist and racist ones. The legal condition of assigning Türk asıllı of Turkish origin vice principals to Armenian schools in Istanbul is just one example that discriminates between Armenians and Turks on the basis of lineage. On the other hand, the Muslim Armenians are not exempt from, and this is a paradox, religious discrimination either. It's just that in their case, religion and its conception are also somehow racialized. In fact, Gâvur is just one step away from Gâvuroğlu, and many descendants of Islamized Armenians are also called Gâvur and have their allegiance and belonging to Islam questioned or rejected only because of their ancestors' Gâvurluk, that is infidelity. Gâvur Hasan, Gâvur Ahmet, Gâvur Mehmet are a few examples of Muslim Armenians having clearly Islamic names but singled out by the label Gâvur. Similarly, the word dönme, meaning convert, is also used for descendants of converts, thus making conversion, religion, and the associated discrimination somehow hereditary as well. The parallel working of the two regimes of religious and racial exclusion appears most clearly in the following scheme. Using the racial genealogical regime of exclusion, a Muslim or Alevi descendant of a Christian Armenian is declared a Gâvuroğlu, then Gâvur, because of their ancestry. Now, once categorized as a Gâvur, the religious regime of exclusion is already there at work. Thus, it's like one has no way to belong. These observations raise further questions about the workings of Turkish exclusivist nationalist thinking, about the construction of Turkishness in relation to its many others, and about the extent, various forms, and manifestations of racialized thinking in the country. Questions, perhaps, worth digging deeper and with further rigor, especially at the turn of the Turkish nation-state's first century. Thank you for your patience.
Ama şimdi geliyor. Tamam. Çok teşekkürler Hrag.
Thank you very much, Hrag. This was a great presentation. Special thanks, particularly because I myself work on racial discrimination, because your study once again confirms that a Turkish nation state was built on top of racial discrimination, and this is rather a racialist space. And we have actually had some headlines in newspapers when for the first time a district governor was of Armenian origin from Turkey. It was such a big news that it made headlines because it was happening for the first time in the history of the Republic. So happy man who says I'm a Turk is not necessarily a sentence of joy, but it's actually a warning, and we should be abiding by this warning, obeying this warning. So this was a very precious presentation. Thank you very much for your contribution, Hrag.